here to talk to you about the worldview of the patriarchy. So I'd like to start with, what is the patriarchy? And obviously it's a very broad worldview, and because of that, I'd like to define it in terms of today's context. And that is men establishing or inheriting a social order where they dominate with positions of power and authority. And it's very hard to talk about the patriarchy without also looking at it through a feminist lens. And obviously feminism is its own worldview as well, but very often patriarchy and feminism go hand in hand. So with the patriarchy through a feminist lens, is that feminist thinkers believe that the patriarchy signifies the cultural and social domination of especially women by men. And in today's presentation, I'm going to talk about and reference to the four concepts of the patriarchy that were defined by Karen Warren in 1994. And she theorized that the patriarchy, more often than not, follows these four concepts. And that's hierarchical thinking, power and privilege, domination, and dualism. And we'll come back and reference those throughout my talk. So firstly, I'd like to talk about my own experience with the patriarchy. And the main influence was definitely, for me, from my nana and granddad. And a little bit of background, both my parents were full-time workers growing up, and because of that, I spent a very large majority of my time growing up being looked after by my nana and granddad. So they had a huge influence on my worldview, and their relationship was a very typical patriarchal setup, which really influenced my own view on what my role was in relationships and within my family. So my granddad was the typical breadwinner. He was the head of the family, the final authority, the worker, the provider. He managed the orchard. He didn't cook, he didn't clean. That was my nana's job in the family's eyes. And this is my nana here. She never had a job when I was growing up. Her job was to look after me and my cousins, to do the cooking, the cleaning, the baking, and it was just really obvious to see that power dynamic with my granddad at the top and her taking on a more submissive and very caring and nurturing role, which is kind of another hallmark of a patriarchal setup, with my granddad being the patriarch of the family. And there were many ways that they established that power dynamic. One, my nana didn't have a job. She was very reliant on my granddad for her source of income. And also, she never had a driver's license or a car. So anywhere that she wanted to go, she relied on my granddad for that as well. And so that impact on me growing up was that I thought when I would finally get into a relationship, that would be my role. My nana's role would be the role that I had, and that I would need to be the caretaker. I would need to be the submissive person in the relationship. And that really transferred into my role at family events and within my family as well. And that only changed as I got a lot older and saw different representations of relationships in the media and in my life as well. So, and now I'd like to move on to the patriarchy's impact on midwives and women. And because, as I mentioned earlier, the patriarchy is such a wide worldview, and so there are many different ways that this way of thinking has impacted midwives and childbirth over the years. But I've decided to focus on its impact on midwives who want to facilitate a physiological birth, but in obstetric-led units. So the main study that I used for my source came from the Keating and Fleming study. And they did a big systematic review of a whole lot of different midwives' experiences in different obstetric units around the world. And they showed that these units tend to show all the hallmarks of a patriarchal setup, particularly using hierarchy and different power, and using hierarchy to establish a power dynamic which placed midwives at the bottom, diminishing their role and diminishing their ability to speak up and utilize their midwifery skills and their inherent skills as women to facilitate physiological births for mothers. Midwives also said that many hospitals followed an active management system with highly medicalised births. Obstetricians were at the top. They were the main authority in births, and the mothers and the midwives were placed at the bottom. And many midwives felt that they were at risk of ridicule for not conforming to the medical model of birth, and that if they wanted to facilitate a physiological birth for a mother, they had to do it discreetly. And I think that really shows how the patriarchy is able to silence women's voices and women's choices, and really diminish our roles. And so leading on, mothers were often at the bottom of these hierarchies, and they lost their chance to give informed consent and ended up passive in their own births. And a really good example of that is a woman who wrote an article about her experiences of her 2 births in an obstetric-led unit in the US. She said that she was bullied and coerced into choices, and they used misogynistic and restrictive language to force her into making choices that she didn't necessarily think was best for her. But she summed it up in a way that by saying pregnant people have a lot of experience being told what to do with their bodies, and because of that, it's very easy for them to forget that they alone are the one who gets to make the choices for their own bodies. But because they're felt and made to question the safety of their own choices and the safety of their own knowledge, they feel as though they can't do that. And once again, it's a really good example of how the patriarchy diminishes and puts women at the bottom of these situations. So obviously the patriarchy has had a massive impact on women and in childbirth. So in conclusion, unfortunately the patriarchy is an unavoidable and embedded part of the society that we live in. But that being said, there are ways as health providers and as women that we can fight back and lessen its impact by respecting and breaking down that hierarchy, by working in partnership with the women that we're caring for, and by lifting them up and making them feel as though they can make their own choices and take control of their birthing experience. And I would like to end with a quote by Franca Kitty, which I feel like really nicely sums up the way that we can go forward. And that is, she sees organisations working in the gender equality space as instrumental in transforming the narrative of women as much more than the patriarchy has painted them. They are autonomous and they are powerful. And with that, I'd like to end my presentation for today. I'd just like to end with my reference list, and thank you for listening.